November 10th, 1852, the Grand Trunk Railway Company of Canada was formed and began building a railway between Montreal and Toronto. In August of 1853, the Grand Trunk took over the Atlantic and St. Lawrence Railway as well, connecting them to the coast in Portland, Maine. The first railway to build in Canada was the London and Gore Railway, a British railway firm that eventually got absorbed by the Great Western Railway, which in turn was taken over by the Grand Trunk Railway. They also took over 3 other railways in the eastern United States. In 1855, the Grand Trunk operated its first train between Toronto and Brampton. When the Grand Trunk began construction, they used the British 19th century broad 5-foot 6-inch gauge. So that didn't work so well when connecting to the US gauge railways across the border. So in 1872, they began changing over to the standard US gauge of 4 foot 8.5 inches. Of course, that incurred a lot of costs, having to convert all of the rolling stock over to that new gauge as well. Building a railway in those days was definitely no easy task and took a long time to do. In the late 1800s, the Grand Trunk Railway spread throughout southern Ontario, as well as Quebec, and into the United States. Despite financial difficulties, the Grand Trunk Railway grew at a steady pace. Definitely one of the most notable achievements of the Grand Trunk Railway was the Victoria Bridge across the St. Lawrence River at Montreal. This steel tube bridge is nearly 3 kilometers long and was an engineering marvel for its time. In 1892, the bridge was replaced with this open, steel-structured bridge that is still in use today. The bridge includes 2 lift bridges and road traffic on both sides. At the time of Canada's Confederation, the Grand Trunk Railway was the world's largest railway system, with more than 2,055 kilometers of track, 700 locomotives, 578 cars, 60 post office cars, 131 baggage cars, and 18,000 freight cars. To celebrate this achievement, a new logo appeared for the Grand Trunk. In the late 1800s, competition for the Grand Trunk Railway in southern Ontario was fierce. This included the Great Northern Railway, the well-established Great Western Railway, and the Midland Railway. This put tremendous pressure on the already crowded Toronto Union Station. So that station was torn down and a new one was built just a few blocks away in 1873. And just when you thought the railway landscape was settling down, in 1881, the newly established Canadian Pacific Railway just entered the also crowded southern Ontario market. Hearing rumblings of backdoor deals being had between Canadian Pacific and some of the other railways, the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway swiftly made partnerships and took over operations of some of the previously mentioned railways, allowing them to start building north and west on what was the Northern Railway of Canada that had already built as far north as North Bay, Ontario. And during this time, the Grand Trunk Railway invested massive amounts of money in infrastructure improvements, which included rehabilitating bridges, building new yards, and double tracking from Montreal to Sarnia. As you can well imagine, this put a lot of financial stress on the railway. But with Canadian Pacific's Western Line already open all the way to the coast, the Canadian government formed the National Transcontinental Railway, building west from Quebec, through Fort William, which eventually turns into Thunder Bay, and in 1903 the Grand Trunk Pacific was formed. The Canadian government wanted a railway that was more centralized through Canada, and the Grand Trunk Pacific was the answer to that problem. In 1905, construction started on building from what is now Thunder Bay to Winnipeg, Manitoba, and from Prince Rupert eastward at the same time. The Grand Trunk Pacific suffered the same issues that Canadian Pacific suffered from, and that was worker shortage. So they brought people over from Asia and Europe to help with the build. Between 1905 and 1914, the Grand Trunk Pacific built west, building many bridges along the way, arriving in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan in 1908. In 1909 is when the Grand Trunk Pacific reached Edmonton, and that's when the financial difficulties really became clear. Competing with the Canadian Northern Railway that also built roughly in the same area made things even more challenging. As the Grand Trunk Pacific built west, they also built communities along the line. The very unique thing about the Grand Trunk Pacific is that they built the communities and named them alphabetically. If you look at a map today even, you will see many of the town sites along the Grand Trunk Pacific as they build west go in alphabetical order. Some railroad employees even called it the Alphabet Railway. Some, but not all, of these iconic railway stations still remain today. Building through central Manitoba and central Saskatchewan was relatively easy because it was somewhat flat terrain to deal with. But once you got to Alberta, the terrain changed dramatically. Unlike the southern route that Canadian Pacific chose, the central route through Alberta had a lot more grades and bridges that had to be built in place. It wasn't until Canadian Pacific reached the mountains where the difficulty for them became much more challenging. One of the Grand Trunk Pacific's most notable achievements was the Duhamel Bridge, completed in 1910 over the Battle River on the line going from Edmonton to Calgary. At nearly 4,000 feet long and 110 feet high, it was the largest bridge of its kind in the world during its time. As mentioned earlier, the Canadian Northern Railway had also begun building track west from Quebec through Ottawa, Toronto, Thunder Bay, Winnipeg, and westward towards Edmonton. Arriving in 1905, the CNOR managed to outpace and outbuild the Grand Trunk Pacific building west. You can see here where the two railways in a lot of locations ran almost parallel to each other, particularly west of Edmonton, Alberta. Competition from other railways in the Edmonton area was also very fierce, and the CNOR had established itself very well in the area, including building many branch lines all over the province of Alberta and Saskatchewan. Meanwhile, the Grand Trunk Pacific focused on continuing to build west towards Jasper and reached Jasper at around 1911. Building west to Prince Rupert was very controversial for the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway, as many thought going to the south towards Kamloops and then Vancouver would have been a better option, and partnering with the Canadian Northern, who eventually chose that route. The Grand Trunk Pacific was also building from the west coast at Prince Rupert eastward, and they met at Fort Fraser, British Columbia on April 7, 1914, where the last spike ceremony took place. By 1914, the Grand Trunk Pacific was in financial ruin, mostly due to cost overruns, delays, and competition. In 1919, the Grand Trunk and the Grand Trunk Pacific declared bankruptcy, and as fate would have it, the Canadian Northern Railway also succumbed to the same fate almost at the same time. The Canadian government took over operations of both railways and formed the Canadian National Railway in 1923. The Canadian National Railway spent the next number of years consolidating and removing duplication between the Grand Trunk Pacific and the Canadian Northern Railway, often choosing the Grand Trunk Pacific's route due to the better quality build. If you watch my videos on a regular basis, why don't you subscribe to my channel? And remember to leave a like, as that helps the YouTube algorithm recommend it to other viewers.
for